Well, I want to start this sermon by asking you to imagine something. Imagine that you're a 4th century BCE Chinese emperor, okay? Can you do that? No, I know it's a stretch, but just think of it. I want to tell you a story that comes from the 4th century Chinese empire. This is BCE, before the Common Era, before the life of Christianity. 300 years before that. The story's about an emperor who's sitting on the ledge of a window looking out onto his courtyard. And as it usually happens, somebody comes along and needs him. So a man leading an ox comes past, and the man's carrying a long knife. And the emperor says, as emperors are wont to do, "Pray tell me, sir, where are you going with this ox?" And the man says, "To consecrate the new bell with his blood." And the emperor looks at the man and he looks at the ox and he says, "But this ox looks terrified, as if he's going to the gates of death. Surely we could do something else." And the man says, "What, don't consecrate the bell?" And the emperor waits a moment, he thinks, and he says, "Go get the sheep. Forget the ox." Right? So here's the emperor, right? He's sitting there. He's just trying to take a little break in his life. Anybody ever sit and stare a little bit? I've been encouraging you to do a lot of staring. He's taking a break from being king. He's leaning out his window. All he wants to do is watch the wind flow through the trees and his neighbors sweep their porch off in the distance. And here comes the man with the ox. Where are you going with that ox? It's not a question any of you will ask today. To consecrate the bell, to sacrifice this ox, the king thinks, that's pretty amazing. This king probably never sacrificed anything, right? He's hardly cut anything, maybe just his meat on his table. And here goes this ox. So all of a sudden, from a break, the king is back at work, because his work is to make decisions. This isn't the sink is leaking, call the plumber. This isn't my iPhone is cracked, go to the mall and get it fixed. This is a life-changing decision, at least for the ox. But maybe for the man, too, if we go back and potentially we translate what this is all about. We might say, well, maybe the king is thinking about the karma first of the man who must kill this large beast. All of a sudden, there's a dilemma. It's a moral dilemma, a values-based decision. Not to be made by plumbers or Apple Store employees, but by the heart and the mind. I want you to consider briefly what kinds of values-based decisions you make. No one in this room makes strictly practical decisions. We all make values-based decisions. Are we making money at the expense of others or in support of others? Are we helping our families make an impact for the common good or not? Are we destroying the environment with our appetites and our homes? Are we considering what we spend, save, give, and sacrifice? Are we considering how we speak in response to our partners and children? Are we treading lightly? Are we conserving energy? Are we minimizing our carbon footprint? These last ones came from a Facebook question that you can visit on my page if you'd like. But the point is that few decisions are isolated and strictly practical. All decisions, in a way, have a greater impact. If you want to read some more on this, read Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, Nobel Prize winners on decision biases. They say that the human experience is that we fall into traps in decision-making. Chief among them, regarding decisions that people later come to regret, is the failure to evaluate decisions in a comprehensive way that focuses on values trade-offs. So what kind of impacts do our decisions have? Not only for us, but beyond us. The king is faced with a decision. What he says is this: the ox looks afraid. The man with the ox now reacts, so don't consecrate the bell. The question becomes about a higher good. It's possible that this now becomes about an unconsecrated bell, which we might imagine is a curse on the kingdom, or unusable in rituals, or maybe it's just going to make the queen mad because she said, hang the bell, right? The king looks at the man, at the ox, and says, go get the sheep. It's not an unreasonable decision. The king sees the ox. The ox looks terrified. The man with the knife just wants to get on with the day. So go get the sheep. Here's what Mengzi, the ancient Chinese philosopher, said of this: the heart suffices for being a worthy king. The people might think the king is biased, but the king did not see the sheep. He only saw the ox. The translation in Chinese of compassion, remember our theme year, living compassion. The Chinese say is the heart of not bearing. The heart of not bearing. Chinese philosophy says in this case we feel for the ox, but not the sheep, because we do not see the sheep. But as much as our decisions matter, what we choose to see, what we can or cannot see, is what I want to talk about today. Last week I set up the model for compassion with Aung San Suu Kyi's 3 parts to compassion. She said we must see, feel, and then act. The first task is to see, and I don't mean with our eyes. I'm aware of how people who without physical sight see sometimes better than I do. I was telling someone about this moment in my early ministry. I was a young minister in Boston, and a member of my church who was blind had a service dog and was a lay reader in the worship, was with me before a Sunday worship one morning, and he turns to me and he says, "You're afraid." And I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "I know you're afraid." I said, "You're right." He didn't need eyes to see that. He saw through the heart, like the Chinese philosophy, to not bear another's pain, to not bear another's suffering. The challenge is to see beyond the horizons of our lives, to see beyond the spheres of our influence, to see beyond the practical lives we lead. That's the challenge, the spiritual challenge of all time. And the Christians have been talking about this for 2,000 years. In the time of Jesus, 20% of people were blind. 1 in 10 people in that time had one eye, and without glasses or eye surgery, we could guess that almost half of the people could not see the details in the stars above or in the faces of their loved ones. So it's no surprise that there are at least 4 instances in which Jesus heals the blind, those who do not see. Now, I know I don't have to tell you this, but I don't believe in miracles. But I do believe in metaphor. And so in this story, Jesus heals a blind man. He takes him from Bethesda, not Bethesda, Maryland. He takes him from the Bethesda fountain. Remember, that fountain was where those who were crippled and had leprosy and had blindness and had all manner of different abilities or disease would sit around that fountain until an angel troubled the water, right? You've heard the song, Trouble the Water. And the first one in the pool would be healed, was the legend. It was sort of like last one in is a rotten egg, but the opposite. The first one in was healed. So Jesus takes this man and he brings him out of the city of Bethesda. Maybe the writers want us to know that he's trying to avoid a riot, a healing riot. And he takes the man and he spits in his hands and he puts it on the man's eyes. The man's a little surprised. And he opens his eyes and he says, "I see men and trees walking." So it's a little better, but it's not perfect. And then he does it again. He spits and he puts his hands on the eyes and the man can see. Not miracle, but metaphor. What is it saying to us? The story tells us that two things, I think, that sometimes healing takes a process. It takes time. And it might come in unexpected ways. And above all, the healing the blind man isn't about the man at all. It's about healing mankind, helping us to see the way we turn our back on the poor, to help us see the way that we imprison black youth at a disproportional rate, to see the way we treat each other based on race and class, to see the stigmas we put on those differently abled and those with mental illness, to see, above all, the pain of others, which is not something we teach a lot in this society. Jesus doesn't heal the man at the fountain, maybe to avoid the rush, but more likely he knows that mankind must not wait for miracles to see another's suffering. Those who wrote this story want us to make a decision to see that the spiritual life resides outside the everyday concerns of plumbing and iPhones, but rather in the deeper realms. And always with regards to another's suffering. Those who we can see and those who we can't. The ox and the sheep. To see, Aung San Suu Kyi said, to courageously see the connection between ourselves and those who suffer. Whether they be our own children or the people of Ferguson, Missouri, or abusive, violent NFL superstars, that is the beginning of compassion. Which brings us to love as I back into the message of this service. Love and compassion are not the same. To love is to have strong feelings of like, or to have an affection like Billy Collins sort of playfully talked about in the poem that Irene read. To fall in love with the broth of the soup or the soap in the hand. But to have compassion is a strong feeling of sympathy and sadness for the suffering and bad luck of others. And to wish to help, like the Sandberg poem Irene read first, to see the masses of the poor and to know the suffering. We don't have to love to see another's suffering. We don't have to love to have compassion. We don't have to love the executioners of ISIS to see that their violence comes from a deep, deep place of suffering. We don't have to love abusive NFL players to see that their violence and their acting out comes from a deep, deep place of suffering. Love is personal and messy, but compassion is selfless. It is impersonal, in a way, because it exists without any relationship at all. Now, here is the trick. To have compassion we must know love. To have compassion, we must love and be loved. It starts in our own families, and if not there, then in the circles of hope we build. And if not there, then we must know a love that comes from something greater, something more mysterious that some call God and some just call love. That comfort and well-being that says you are loved. Without understanding that deeply, there is no way to compassion. The Chinese philosophers said, for the king to see the sheep as equal to the ox requires a heart feeling. It is Ren in Chinese, translated as humaneness, benevolence, becoming vulnerable, engaging with each other, valuing peace, entangling ourselves in the difficult, complex realities of the world. Ren. So Ferguson, Missouri isn't just something that's happening north and east of us, nor is the violence in Gaza and the widespread destruction of the relationship between the Jews and the Palestinians. But it's happening within. It's happening in the human family, and so it must change us. Mengzi said, to be human is to be humane. So love, the cure to our blindness and the beginning of compassion. I want to challenge you to see this week, to challenge any blindness you might have by doing two things, by making a list of all the suffering you notice that you didn't notice before, and to list the people you know who are suffering and the people you don't know who are suffering, and to meditate on it and to meditate on love, that love that abides among us always. A colleague and friend, Rebecca Parker, wrote an encouraging prayer which we can use to do this, and it's on the back of the order of service. Now, I will testify to you that the first time I said this prayer, I thought it was forced, but I have said it many times. And this prayer has expanded my vision, has cured my blindness to the suffering of many. So I invite you today and this week to say this prayer with me now. And when we say we pray for, I invite you to name those who suffer or need our love. Ready? There is a love holding me. There is a love holding you. There is love holding all. I rest in this love. We pray for. In this love. We pray for. In this love. May love always abide. Amen.